So 2 members of Congress took an unauthorized trip to Afghanistan to witness the evacuation. Massachusetts Democrat Seth Moulton and Michigan Republican Peter Mayer secretly flew to Kabul on Tuesday. Congressman Moulton tweeted that the trip was to serve as an oversight on the executive branch. The Biden administration bashed the trip, arguing that the lawmakers had to be tended to and drained resources in Kabul needed to help evacuate people. Culture editor at The Federalist, Emily Jashinsky, and host of Working People podcast, Max Alvarez, join us now to weigh in. Welcome, Emily and Max.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So, Max, I'll go to you first. What do you make of this undisclosed, unauthorized visit by these 2 lawmakers, one Democrat and one Republican, to Kabul?
I don't know. I mean, I guess my initial response was, where was this zeal for executive oversight for the past 20 years when we've been dumping endless amounts of money into an ever-increasing military budget for a military exploit in Afghanistan, whose futility we've all witnessed, like in the past couple of weeks, right? Not that I'm opposed to kind of like the principle of it, right? I think Biden should be rightly criticized for how he's handled this. But I think that really kind of nitpicking about this sort of end game and talking about how it's going to drain resources from people who need to be, evacuated. It's a very selective critique of this sort of practice that, again, when you take in the totality of the cost of the U.S. war in Afghanistan, the amount of resources that it has taken away, not from the American people, from other areas of government, from other things that we could and need to do, it's just no one has a real leg to stand on here. No one in Congress, for that matter, and certainly no one in the White House.
Do we even know what kind of plane they flew in on? I mean, could they take some refugees with them if they're going to be flying in and out?
So it was a military aircraft. They flew in on a C-17, and I guess they did wait for flights to go out afterward and then had 2 seats held for them. And I should note, both are veterans, both served in both Iraq and Afghanistan.
I heard they were Iron Man backpacks, and that they actually flew.
Well, they've got that going on here at LAX. There's that rocket.
It was a
man,
Harold and Kumar situation where they were on a hang glider going into Afghanistan.
Yeah,
at least it was bipartisan stupidity, right? I mean, this just seems like the dumbest thing during an evacuation when we've got all this chaos going on and people trying to get out of there. These guys fly in for oversight. I mean, at least it was bipartisan stupidity on this one. Emily, what do you think of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think to Max's point, nobody has a leg to stand on here. But at the same time, hypothetically, I actually understand their point, right? That there's nowhere in the world where oversight is needed more right now than this. And I think we've seen the perils of the bureaucracy and the red tape and all of these various problems as it comes to this evacuation effort. And so I do actually think there's a point there, right? It's a question of whether we trust their motives. And I don't really trust their motives because I think there is actually something to be said for having some congressional oversight of this process. Had they hypothetically come back with some information that is crucially important and that wasn't getting to the public and that wasn't on the congressional radar to the extent that people in Congress can do something and not spend their Sunday at Central Park with dancing with Stephen Colbert like Chuck Schumer was doing. Okay, there's that. But if they had come back with some crucial bit of information, hypothetically, I don't think I would have had a problem with the trip. So at this point, it's do we trust their motivations? No, I don't trust their motivations. But is there some principle behind it that I can agree with? Yeah, probably.
But then Moulton came back and in his statement said that there weren't words for what he saw. It was indescribable. Well, then what good is your oversight if you can't describe this to us? Send somebody over there that can describe it to us. What I saw was indescribable. Well, thank you, Congressman. We really appreciate that. This week with the Gottheimer fiasco, he really kind of rose in the rankings of the least popular Democrat in the caucus. But now with Moulton's trip, he's always been neck and neck with Gottheimer. This has put him back in contention for it. And Emily, I'm curious on the Republican side, how are Republicans receiving this Mayer news?
I mean, I haven't seen much conversation about it at all, other than just sort of absorbing the report. And I think this is something that is irked the left, I think, particularly because it involves Moulton. And I think you just made that point really well, Ryan, in that there's something about, in terms of like the motivations here, as I was just talking about, where is there some sort of principle that makes sense behind this? Yeah, probably. If you come back and say that it was indescribable and come with no information that seems to move the ball forward, that seems to actually be making a difference to the extent that the cost-benefit analysis works out in favor of you taking up those resources and taking up the seats on the military plane, okay, great. Then what's the, like, why are you doing it? And I think the fact that it was Seth Moulton in particular is what is really, really irking the left, because it's him. And I think there's fair reason for that, because it gets to the question of, if you're going to do this, we want to understand if your motivations are in the right place. And with Moulton, I think the left has a lot of reasons to be suspect.
And one thing I just want to know, Peter Mayer is somebody who's been an advocate for helping civs and Afghan refugees months before we pulled out of Kabul, months before we pulled forces out of Afghanistan. He's been one of the leading congressional voices on this, a veteran, obviously, himself. And I know was trying to work with the White House and trying to find how we could help on a bipartisan basis. So it's not like he's stepping into something that he doesn't have credibility on and hasn't been engaged in purely for partisan reasons. So I think he might get a bit more of a pass. Moulton is a different character and people view him very differently. But I give credit to Peter. He's been somebody who's been a leading voice on we need to help civs get out of the country, get them relocated. He had a Bring Him to Guam bill that was about relocating them to even temporarily to Guam, and has been a leader on this issue for some time.
Well, these guys did come back, and didn't they say it's so bad that that what is needed is so massive that there is just no way to do it? That not only are we not going to meet the deadline, that even if we went indefinitely forever and ever, we just wouldn't possibly be able to finish whatever it is that we would need, getting everybody out of there. So they're essentially saying, might as well cut it off at August 31st. I mean, this is the report I was hearing. I'm not sure if it's totally accurate, but they were saying might as well cut it off at August 31st because it's just, otherwise it's never ending. So I'm curious, Max, from your perspective, if we do leave August 31st and there are a bunch of people left behind, do you think this is going to negatively impact the Biden administration?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it will. I mean, it's been a really exhausting and exasperating, right, to hear the old ghoulish Democratic Party machine language about optics like dominate every aspect of this coverage over the past 2 weeks. I think people who are just watching from their living rooms can generally kind of see the injustice and the hypocrisy of, prizing optics over humanity. But that's really just the nature of, our politics. I think that, it's obviously going to be something that Biden can be hammered on. I mean, I think that, their Biden administration is doing its best to kind of emphasize that in terms of us being in Afghanistan, this was a necessary decision. But I think that the kind of scenes of horror that we're seeing, the concern over how many refugees to take in because of the quote unquote optics, is another thing that I think is going to piss people off on, either side. So he's really just got to kind of pick a lane and go with it. But I think to circle back to one kind of takeaway point that's really irking me about all this, even with this sort of trip that Moulton and Mayer kind of took, is that it's very reminiscent of, again, the kind of false opposition to the military-industrial complex and the perma-war machine that we've seen over the past 20 years, where the main objection that comes from places like Congress isn't the premise of the failed war itself, isn't kind of the endless and infinitely expanding budget of the military-industrial complex. None of that is really the issue. It's always, we didn't procedurally go through all the necessary steps to make this as legitimate as we want it to, right? So now we're focusing on the legitimacy or the steps that were or weren't taken in this sort of exit. And we're not really talking about just this catastrophic failure of the U.S. war in Afghanistan itself, which is the really big elephant in the room. So this is not a procedural issue that could have been improved upon all that much. And in that case, I don't really know what Moulton and Mayer are kind of hoping to achieve with this.
Right, and I think that's really well said, because, like, okay, as of now, since the 14th, the U.S. has evacuated 80,000 people. The White House just announced this morning, and so that's quite a feat, tremendous logistical accomplishment on the part of the military, but still, that's 80,000 over 10 days. So if you think back and say, okay, well, let's say they started this earlier, as the mainstream media is saying that they should have done. Within days of them starting this rapid logistical evacuation of people from Afghanistan, who would have been on the first plane? Ghani, the president, would have been out of there. The government would have collapsed immediately. So now you're only a day or two into this logistical challenge. You've only gotten 8,000 or 10,000 people out. Now you have complete chaos in Kabul. And getting to this orderly place of 80,000 you would have had to overcome a bunch of other chaotic challenges. So, the reality that the evacuation itself creates the chaos means that there is no way to do evacuation without chaos.
So disagree there, but I think Max makes an extremely important point, which is we are going to analyze the media, Congress, this evacuation so much and the humanitarian failings around it, the security failings around it, rather than focus on 20 years of a failed war and why we weren't able to get Afghanistan to a place where it was sustainable. But the one thing I disagree with Ryan on is there's an unfolding humanitarian crisis, and we can't pretend that people aren't living in dire situations, that the airport is secure, that there aren't threats of ISIS-K, the Haqqani network, et cetera. So there is kind of an urgent need there that I think is valid, but we shouldn't lose the forest of the 20-year war through the trees of this, the last 2 weeks.
We'll see how it plays out once the evacuation's over and we're out. I think then we'll see how the media reacts. Are they just, my guess is they're just going to ignore Afghanistan altogether. They're just never going to talk about it again. Or if they do, they're just going to say, oh, no, look at all the people in Afghanistan and how horrible this is and we should have stayed, possibly. But I think we kind of have to wait and see how they ultimately report on this when it's all said and done.
And Emily, do you think that the media kind of is focused on this relentlessly, deliberately to avoid talking about the last 20 years, or do you think that this is just how the media, like a cat chasing a laser, operates?
It's the latter. I think this is exactly what happens with the media is they take the bait that's being offered to them by the political establishment and reflect it. And we saw that with all of the intel community leaks last week. It's the same thing. They take the agenda that is being pushed to them by the political establishment. And it is very interesting to see that, especially when it comes to foreign policy, because we see it all of the time on sort of like cultural issues. But when it comes to foreign policy and when it comes to economics, it gets really, really interesting. And I think that's what we've seen over the course of the last week is that whatever the political establishment is pushing, and in this case, the political establishment is pushing, to use Alyssa's analogy, the trees instead of the forest. So the media is now going to talk about the trees instead of the forest. And so that's what the political establishment is always going to want to talk about because it's a much easier conversation that lets them be in the weeds where they can still be correct to some extent because they're talking about the minutia of logistics and strategy and making really easy partisan hits. Right? Like it's very, very easy to take a swing at Joe Biden over a lot of this stuff, but it's also going to be really easy to sort of fight about the opposition to that, right? This is much easier fight to have, and it's a much easier fight to have on a partisan basis. And that's why it's, being pushed by the establishment, and that's why the media establishment takes what the political establishment is talking about. They're so easily, to Ryan's analogy, the cat following the laser, they're so easily pushed into swallowing these narratives and these agendas, and that dominates the discourse for the entire country.
Yeah, it'd be like if the French media in like the early 19th century just focused instead on Napoleon's decision to invade Russia and instead talked about the chaotic withdrawal from that. But Emily, Max, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Guys.
Thanks, guys.
And so coming up, Brianna Joy Gray breaks down what role wealth plays in the future of a leftist movement when Rising returns.